Should we begin, sir?
Sure.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us in today's memorial talk. All of us are here to celebrate and to learn about the life of Professor Govind Swarup, who recently passed away on 7th September at the age of 91. His long life was accompanied by an extremely successful career in radio astronomy. A true pioneer, he jump-started the country's effort in the nascent field of radio astronomy and built facilities and institutions like GMRT and Ooty Radio Telescope that have put in India in the forefront on the global stage in radio astronomy. He inspired many young Indian minds and was known for his friendly and approachable personality. It would indeed be a very exciting to learn about his life today. We are extremely delighted to have with us today Dr. Ramana Athreya from the Physics Department at IISER Pune as the speaker for today's talk. Dr. Athreya is a renowned astronomer and ecologist. His principal research interests include low radio frequency astronomical phenomena, biological diversity patterns, speciation processes, and wildlife conservation paradigms for Arunachal Pradesh. Sir obtained his PhD at Tata Institute of Fundamental Research and subsequently held postdoctoral positions at NCRA TIFR, Paris Institute of Astrophysics, and European Southern Observatory. Among many other accolades, he has been awarded the Pakshi Shri Award, and in 2011, he was conferred the Whiteley Award for his work on conservation and involving communities in Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary in Arunachal Pradesh. He has known Professor Swarup for a long time. He would surely be having a lot of things to share with us today. So without further ado, I would like to pass over the virtual mic to Professor Athreya. Sir, over to you.
Thank you very much. I was getting very worried that you were going to talk about me much more than about Swarup. Today is certainly not the day for that. At the outset, I must say that when a person of Swarup's eminence passes away, there is a very natural, very human tendency to claim a great deal of proximity with a person like that, not the least because of the vast number of people he's actually touched in his life. I certainly had the privilege of being with Swarup during my PhD in the 1990s. I started in 1989. I completed my PhD in 1996, and then I was there for another year and a half before I went abroad for a PhD, postdoc. Subsequently, I came back to the National Center for Radio Astrophysics in 2003, and I was on the faculty there till 2009. And I met Swarup quite extensively. On the other hand, I must also admit that there are many more people in NCRA who's worked much more closely with Swarup. Even though I met him pretty much every day that he was in the institute, I hadn't really worked very closely with him, largely because while I was doing my PhD, I was focusing on my research where I used telescopes from outside the country, and he was almost completely immersed in the construction of GMRT. I'll come to that. Notwithstanding which, I must say that from that proximity, he's been one of the most inspiring scientists. Well, he's by far the most inspiring scientist that I've ever, it's ever been my privilege to be close to watch from up close. And today's talk is going to be a little bit of a ramble down memory lane. I apologize, or maybe I shouldn't apologize, because that is the way the personal experience has been, and I would like to take you through this personal experience of my life with Swarup over 15 years. My first experience of Professor Swarup was somewhat comic. I was a third-year undergraduate student in undergraduate summer project student at the Radio Astronomy Center in Ooty, and unlike students nowadays, we had a great deal of fun during the project days. our project aspirations during these summer projects was largely to get away to a nice place and have fun. And Ooty was certainly a lovely place to be in, not least because of my interest in natural history and bird watching. And one of the reasons I went to Ooty was I heard some very nice things about the Radio Astronomy Center and its environments. Both the astronomy and the bird watching I expected would be very spectacular. So let me go to what Ooty looks like. That's a Google Eye view of Ooty. Can you see my presentation?
No, Ramana.
You can't see my presentation? Okay, fine. Sorry. Share. No. Stop share. Sorry. Yeah. Can you see it now?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay. So this is what the environments of Uti Radio Astronomy Center looks like on the Nilgiri Plateau. This long strip of bare ground with, there's a periodic grating-like structure. That's actually the Uti Radio Telescope. It's across an entire hillside. And it's actually a good way of looking at a telescope, especially radio interferometers, is in analogy with a grating instrument. And one of the things which attracted me to go there for a summer project was actually this large patch of forest right behind the Ooty Center that I was keen on going to. And to give you another view of the same thing, if you take a slightly larger view of the whole center, it is truly a spectacular place from the natural nature, the splendor of nature out there. Those are the very high elevation grassland shola system with its own very endemic set of species, which is very exciting to work with. So I was in this place and I was having great fun working with a senior PhD student on a summer project in radio astronomy. And one morning I was at the dining room and I saw this somewhat elderly gentleman. I must say, looking back, that elderly gentleman that day was not much older than what I am today. And I would like not to think of myself as an elderly gentleman today. Notwithstanding which, when he came out of the guest house, I nudged my project supervisor. She was a PhD student, Tapasi Ghosh, and I asked her, who's that guy? He looks like Cuthbert Calculus. She sort of, her jaw dropped and said, good Lord, you know who you're talking about? That's Govind Swarup. Well, I hadn't really heard much of Govind Swarup. As I said, I had come to Radio Astronomy Center for other reasons. I was still having a very leisurely breakfast. It was 10 o'clock. And Swarup came into the dining room and the rest of the dining room vanished. I'm not sure it was cause and effect. As I learned later, it could well have been cause and effect. Swarup entered the room. He saw that I was the only person in the room. Remember, Swarup was already a famous man, though I didn't know much about it. He walked up to me and said, could he sit at my table? And I said, sure. And he talked to me for the next 2 to 3 hours. It was just incredible. I mean, you have to see the context. I was a summer student and he was the director, one of the most famous radio astronomers in the country, the most famous radio astronomers in the country. He sat and wove this spell of magic. He talked to me about Columbus and the age of discovery, and he talked about how 1992 would be the 500th anniversary of the age of discovery, of Columbus's discovery of the New World, and that he was building this telescope which would take us on this voyage of discovery. And who was he building it for? He was building it for us. Actually, he was building it for me. Those 2.5 hours was one of the most incredible efforts at seduction that I've come across. And you know what? He succeeded. He was trying hard to convince students to stay back in India and do their PhD here. He wanted to build a telescope. So he led me through the problems of going abroad with a begging bowl, asking for resources to do research. And he said, what you people must understand is that I'm going to build a telescope for you to be used here. and people from abroad will come here and beg to use the telescope. It was a very heady lecture he gave me, and as I realized, he gave that same heady lecture to several of us of that generation. And most of us, or at least many of us, stayed back to do a PhD for what would be, hoping to do a PhD with what would become the GMRT, the Giant Meter Wave Radio Telescope. As it happened, to some extent, he conned us. He had promised to build that telescope by 1992 so that I could complete my thesis with it. But he didn't build the telescope by 1992. It came much later, but I can tell you that it was a wonderful experience. Watching the process by which the telescope was being built, I'll come to that in a little while. And I don't think I've ever regretted the fact that I spent the formative years of my professional life with Govind. In fact, far from that, I think it's been a remarkable experience. I will quickly rush through Govind's achievements, as it were. I'll do it very quickly because these are some of the things that you can find in many books on the web. Whereas I would like to focus actually more upon the personal experience I had, as I said, watching him while growing up in my professional career. So Swarup was born in 1929 in a place called Thakurdwara in UP. As he said, I think he came from a very well-to-do family, probably zamindars of that area. And he said that his family used to host a lot of sadhus and sants who used to go up into the hills on their pilgrimage, and they used to pass through his house. And remember, he telling us with a very impish grin, he said, I think pretty much that experience with sadhus and sants sorted out my attitude towards God and Godmen right from a very young age. He did his PhD from Allahabad University in 1950. One of the influences in his life during that phase was K.S. Krishnan of Raman Scattering fame. He did his PhD from Stanford, and he joined TIFR in 1963. And it was with the explicit remit from Homi J. Baba to start a radio astronomy group in India, right? Swarup has made several contributions. One of the first ones was actually about how to stably calibrate radio interferometers. His name is associated with it. It's called the round trip phase. Then he built something called the Kalyan Radio Telescope, right? I'll come to that in a little while. Then he built the Ooty Radio Telescope, and then he built the GMRT. Swarup has had many honors. He was a fellow of the Royal Society of London. He's been a fellow of all the national academies in India, the World Academy of Sciences. He's got the Bhatnagar, the Padma Shri. He's got the Herschel Medal of the Royal Astronomical Society, and he got the Groth-Reber Medal. Groth-Reber was the second radio astronomer in the world. So soon after, Karl Jansky used a dipole to detect emission which seemed to be coming from outside the Earth. The Second World War came in, and during that period, most people were focused on other things in life, like survival. And Groth-Reber was the only radio astronomer for almost a decade. So in his honor, the international community of radio astronomers have something called the Groth-Reber Medal, and Swarup is one of the recipients of that. He got it in 2007, right? So let me take you through, as I said, this is going to be a very personal journey. Let me take you quickly through some of the things that we learned from Swarup. So this was a telescope that that Swarup built, the first one that he built in India. It's called the Kalyan Radio Telescope. And the thing I want you to realize is there is a man standing there, and there is a telescope that he built. It's about a man-high telescope. And we will see how Swarup moved up the scale from these somewhat humble beginnings to build one of the finest telescopes in the world at low frequencies, right? His next telescope was the Uti Radio Telescope. you can see why I was enthralled at being in that place, both from the perspective of radio astronomy and from the perspective of natural history. The Ooty Radio Telescope is this large telescope. It's 30 meters wide by 530 meters in length. You see, it's a series of girders along which, if you look at this picture on the bottom left, you will see that the reflecting surface of the telescope is actually a bunch of wires. It's more or less transparent. You can see the clouds through this telescope, and the point about it is he had to build a huge telescope, and he wasn't sure how much of effort and money it would take to build a standard telescope which had a complete dish. So he realized, like some of the others had, that you didn't need a full dish. All he had to do was to run metallic wires all along this 530 meter dish, and his reflecting surface was this bunch of wires. And he had a series of dipole receivers on the top of this, where you can see this here at the top. The whole point of this, the really smart thing that Swarup did was, at that moment, the largest telescope that you could build, which could also be steered around the sky to observe different things in the sky, was about 100 meters. And that took a phenomenal amount of money at that time. What Swarup did was to build this 530 meters by 30 meter telescope, and he strung it out along a hill slope. Let me take you there. He strung it along a hill slope. This is a telescope that, can you see my cursor? Somebody? You can see my cursor?
Yes. Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. So you see this slope with the different parts of the whole area of the telescope, half a kilometer long. He put it on a hillside whose slope was the same as the latitude of the place. And what would that mean? If your telescope axis is along the same slope as the latitude of the place, then this telescope axis is parallel to the Earth's rotation axis, which means you don't have to move the telescope in order to go across the sky, at least in one direction. You can allow the Earth to move objects into your telescope beam. So this was an engineering marvel in that he immediately made it significantly less expensive, because he didn't have to build the tracking system for one axis. He only had to move it along one. Let me rewind that. So he could actually, given the science that he wanted to do, I'll come back to that in a little while. He only had one axis along this north-south direction, and he could either let the telescope, the Earth's rotation, bring sources into his beam, or he could move the telescope across that axis, right? The second thing that he needed to do was, so this got him the east-west movement of the telescope, east-west tracking of a source. What he could also do was use phase shifters in his dipoles. Remember, I told you this was like a grating in the radio frequency regime. He could put phase shifts or electronic phase shifts between these dipoles and make the telescope squint in different directions. So he got a way of making the tracking system of this gigantic telescope much simpler than it had been done before. And he used this to do what is called lunar occultation measurements of the sizes of radio sources, right? So basically he was using this telescope with its ability to track the moon using a very simple tracking system of rotation in one direction and phase shift tracking in the other, electronic phase shift tracking in the other direction, to follow a source as it went behind the limb of the moon and as it exited from the limb of the moon. So he was basically using the moon as a diffraction edge, and you can see the kind of patterns that you would expect from a diffraction edge, right? As a point source goes in and out, you could actually get the diffraction pattern, and they use the diffraction pattern to measure the sizes of radio sources to much smaller than what the telescope resolution itself would have been. It was a very ambitious program. The idea was not his in terms of using lunar occultation, but he made it much simpler in terms of he made a much an instrument which cost a lot less using some of these smart ideas. And his group measured the sizes of a bunch of radio sources using this innovative technique, and it was one of the major contributions of the group to the active debate during those days of whether the universe was a steady state universe, or was it a Big Bang universe with a Big Bang model, the way it started, right? We perhaps don't understand at this time in the evolution of astronomy that 1960s and 1970s, really these questions hadn't been answered in a very convincing manner. And, sorry, is there a question? Sorry, is there a question? Okay. I'm sorry, I can't. Is there a question?
Ramana, it looks like somebody has forgotten to mute their mic.
Okay, fine. Sorry. Okay, so it was this thing, and there are a couple of things I want to talk to you about this particular aspect of Swarup's life. Remember, Swarup in 1970 was only 41 years, very young. He was already famous, but he was still very young, very much a man at the stage in which he was trying to make his career, right? His first student, the one who started with him at the Kalyan Radio Telescope and subsequently moved to Ooty, was Vijay Kapahi. Vijay Kapahi was the second director of the National Center for Radio Astrophysics after Swarup, and he also happened to be my thesis supervisor. And you see this paper by Vijay Kapahi, where they showed, basically the paper is in 1975, Cosmology from Angular Size Counts of Extragalactic Radio Sources. So they took the sizes measured of, you can see on the y-axis is the size as a function of the flux density, which is the emission by the radio telescope. So the points marked in green are the Ooty data. And there was a model prediction that if our universe did not evolve, that is, if it was part of the steady state, if it lived as per the steady state prediction, your sizes of the radio sources were expected to follow the n is equal to 0 curve on top. So these were the initial, so this is the flux density scale. These were the strongest sources measured early on in radio astronomy in the 50s and 60s. These were sources measured by the Cambridge group, and they started, their data suggested that perhaps n is equal to 0 was not appropriate, but from the error bars, 1 sigma error bars, you see that they couldn't really convincingly prove that they could rule out the steady state model. The Ooty data came subsequently, and you can clearly see that the Ooty data showed that n is equal to 0, which was the steady state model, was completely inappropriate, right? Here is something I want you to pay attention to. I don't know if you have noticed it. If this had been a regular lecture with all of us sitting in one hall, I would have paused at this stage and asked, do you see something remarkable here? The remarkable thing here is a man, Govind Swarup, who built a telescope. It was his energy, enthusiasm, and ambition which built the telescope. And he allowed his student to write a single author paper on the most famous result from Ooty. It is not the kind of thing you would expect from too many people. Certainly not at this time. It's really, if you look back, it's really remarkable. The man had spent his life, 10 years of his life. He's only 41 years old. He's an incredibly ambitious man. There's no two ways about it. And yet, when the data came, he allowed his PhD student to write a paper with only himself as the author. I think it required a man of immense self-confidence who understood that he was where he was and that he didn't have to compete with his PhD students. I think this is, to me, it's one of the most important lessons that I've learned from Govind Swarup, that person who's self-confident, who understands his worth, his self-worth, you don't have to worry about how he deals with his neighbors, right? All that Vijay did in that paper is this bland acknowledgement at the bottom. It's a pleasure to thank Professor G. Swarup for his advice and encouragement. That one bland line acknowledges 10 or 12 years of work together, slaving it out, finding a place to build the Uti Radio Telescope, building the telescope, and so on. But I also want to take you to the next slide. It is not as if Govind wanted to give freebies to his students. There were times when he wrote the paper and he was the only author. It's just that he believed that authorship belonged to the people who actually did the work. And he was not embarrassed. In fact, he was pretty proud to acknowledge when his students did the work. He was happy enough to give them the full credit for it. As you can see, these are two other papers. Here is a work that Swarup did. It is his own work. He did the work and he was happy to take the full credit for it. Or when the work was done with a list of people, you can see that even though he was the first author, he was happy to have a lot of people be part of the author list. The point is, for him, authorship was something that you had to earn. It wasn't free. It wasn't free for him as the PI. It wasn't free for him as a PhD supervisor, and it wasn't free for anybody else. If you did the work, you got the credit and you got it by right. I think, to me, this is one of the most remarkable things that I learned from Govind, and it's something which is worth going through for all young students, to realize that there is more to research than grabbing credit where it is not you. Throughout his career, even from a very young age, he allowed his students to write their own papers. And I was observing in 1992 at a place called Las Campanas in Chile. I had gone there for an observing run at a telescope managed by the Carnegie Observatories, very famous institution for astronomy, Carnegie Observatories. And I was having dinner there, and I spent a few days in the company of one of the most famous astronomers of the previous generation, Alan Sandage. Alan Sandage was the heir of Edwin Hubble. Alan Sandage was the premier observational astronomer and the most influential astronomers in the world for decades, between 1930 or 40 till about 1990s. I met him in 1993 towards the end of his career. When he found that I was from TIFR, he asked me, there used to be this young man, I forget his name, I think his name was Kapiha or Kapahi or something. Do you know the guy? I sort of smiled at him and said, well, the man is no longer young, but his name is Kapahi, and I do occasionally meet him because he's my PhD supervisor. He laughed and said, well, the young man did some very nice work during his PhD stage. The reason I'm trying to tell you is not because that Alan Sandage praised Vijay Kapahi, is to point out that Govind knew how important the work was, and yet he was willing to give up his rights to authorship on that paper because he believed that it was Vijay's work. And I think it is something I cannot stress too much for the youngsters who are listening to this. In general, arising from that, I should tell you that in general, Govind's attitude towards his junior colleagues was very remarkable for his time and for this country, I must say. He was extremely liberal. He was very non-hierarchical. The only question he would ask of you was, can you contribute to my vision? Really, that was the only question he ever asked of anybody. Can you contribute to my vision? If you can, the sky was the limit to what you could touch him for. And if you couldn't, after the first few occasions, he would just ignore you. There have been times during my PhD when we were in a seminar, internal seminars at NCRA, and there would be people telling him in public when Swarup made some comment about the appropriateness or otherwise of what was being discussed, the research which was being discussed. I've had people tell him, his students or his students' said, "Oh, Govind, you're talking nonsense. I think you should go back and do your calculations again." And it was not considered a comment either on his ability, or it was not considered rude. That was the kind of environment we grew up in, that questioning authorities was considered the appropriate way of behaving in a research institute. Doesn't happen too often in IISER, not necessarily because it is not encouraged, but somehow that ability to question people without bringing in personalities, I'm afraid, is not a widespread phenomenon. He was also very happy to let youngsters build GMRT. In fact, a lot of GMRT was built, as I told you, he encouraged a lot of youngsters to jump into the GMRT bus. And a lot of GMRT electronics was actually built by people fresh out of undergraduate. There were people in the early 20s. Many engineers joined GMRT soon after their undergraduate degree, worked for 5 years and moved on. In fact, it's pretty remarkable how happy and comfortable he was to allow youngsters the liberty of constructing something so phenomenal. I'll come to the context of GMRT itself, but he always said that we need to recognize that the youngsters coming out of these engineering colleges are the ones who understand the latest technology. What Govind wanted to do was to make sure that he wouldn't let the enthusiasm of these such youngsters run away, but would always be channelized into the right product. And he did that in a remarkable manner. His ability to trust and rely upon youngsters is legendary. One of the things a couple of other things I discovered personally by watching him up close, in conversation with him or in other ways, was he was very ambitious, and he was the first person I found who was not embarrassed at publicly admitting his ambition. He was very clear. He always encouraged ambition, and he would say that your dreams should always be much larger than yourself. And well, you probably fail in some of them, but if you don't dream big, you'll never reach wherever you can reach. It's okay to fail once in a while. It's okay to fail a lot of times. All that really matters is the few times when you do succeed big, and that's what it needs to be. That's a lesson that I have never forgotten. A second lesson I learned was that, again, I should say this with a little bit of apology to my theorist friends. He would say, don't ever define your goals by what theorists say. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. You have to follow your gut. It doesn't matter. And if you do something of very high quality as an experimental physicist, then ultimately whatever you do will be useful. And the third thing I learned from him was never go abroad with a begging bowl. This is something which is very rare in the country. One of the things he would tell us was, never go to a Westerner and say you've come for training. He says that's the academic equivalent of the begging bowl. He would say, when you go abroad, you should go there with the attitude that you have come to learn, but you have also come to teach. You're going there because you're an expert in something. He would always introduce us youngsters to any foreign visitor as saying, oh, here is Sanjay Bhatnagar. He's one of the best guys you can come across in image processing algorithms. You should go and talk to him, and he'll help you with the troubles you're having. To be 23, 24, 25, and to be given such an introduction, I can tell you, was an enormously enabling, enormously confidence building. And he always focused on how to build confidence, that we are not meant to be poor cousins forever, that we need to be able to stand on our own feet, and we need to be able to say, look, we are not just begging for resources, we're going to give you some. And this is something that I will take with me to my grave. It's something which has been the defining feature for a lot of us who joined Swarup's group in the 1990s. You must understand, I'll move on to GMRT. This is, remember I showed you the Kalyan Radio Telescope. That is man high. Ooty Ooty itself was phenomenally large. But that is GMRT. That is one dish. This is the first dish which went up around 92 or 93, I forget. They tried two methods. One was to build the dish on the ground and then raise it. And the other was to build the dish off the ground itself. I want you to see and appreciate the scale of GMRT. It's really phenomenal. Even today, even though I've spent years and years in GMRT, even today, whenever I go there, it gives me the goose pimples. It's a phenomenally large thing. These are radio telescopes. You can see the vehicle. That's a Jeep. That's a large size Jeep, considerably in the foreground. This little black spot you see is a man-high door. That's how you enter the telescope. That is 2 to 2.5 meters high. That gives you a sense of how phenomenal this structure is. And to use a figurative description, that entire structure can turn on a dime, essentially. You can point it with immense accuracy, a structure of that size. Again, to give you the context of GMRT, it was built at a time when theoretical physics was considered a very poor cousin of physics. Essentially, the attitude was, if you didn't know how to be a good theoretical physicist, you should become an experimental physicist. Sorry, I don't know if I said it the right way the first time. Experimental physics was viewed in a very poor manner, and it was considered that the only people who became experimental physicists were those who were not good enough as theoretical physics. I'm happy to note IISER has contributed substantially to conveying to students the belief that experimental physics is something as important as any theoretical work. And in fact, in any good physics community, you need to have both of them going hand in hand to push each other onwards. You should also recall that 1990 was the time of the worst economic crisis in the Indian society. We pretty much hawked our family gold to tide us over the crisis of balance of payments. It was during that period that Swarup managed to get 30 crores. It's a laughable sum. 30 crores is what he got to build a telescope of that size. 30 crores, even if you account for inflation, is pretty much nothing. You're talking about 150 to 200 crores now. And I'm not sure how he built the telescope. I've asked him this question. Many people have asked him this question. How did you think you could build a telescope like that for 30 crores? Nobody would have tried it anywhere in the world. He said he didn't have a choice. That was all the money that was forthcoming. If he had asked for any more, they would have said, no, we don't have the money. Somehow he made those 30 crores last the whole distance. There was the other issues with the telescope. People don't always realize how faint are radio signals that are received by radio telescopes. A good illustration that I have always used in my classes is that if you take a sheet of paper and turn it around, one sheet of paper and turn it around, the total amount of energy you consume to turn that sheet of paper is much greater than the sum total of all the radio energy received by all the radio telescopes in the last 100 years. And that includes telescopes which study the sun. It's really an incredible small amount. In fact, the unit of radio astronomy is called Jansky, after the father of radio astronomy. It's measured in units of 10 to the power of minus 26. It's a number so small that we don't even understand it. 10 to the power of minus 26 watts per meter square per hertz. And nowadays, GMRT is trying to measure microjanskis, tens of microjanskis. We're talking of such phenomenally low amount of power. You can understand how sensitive the telescope has to be, but you can also understand that an instrument so sensitive would be impacted by just about anything that you do. If you sneeze, well, sneezing is a bit of an exaggeration, but pretty much if you sneeze, you will have an electromagnetic radiation which will go and be detected by the telescope. Your spark plugs in every vehicle passing by GMRT contribute to it. Your TV stations contribute to it. Your mobile stations are like devastating on the telescope. And a large part of the effort at GMRT has been to figure out how to stop people around the area from contaminating. When this telescope site was chosen in the mid 1980s, it was the middle of nowhere. But by the time the telescope started coming up in early 1990s, the mobile revolution had happened, the television revolution had happened, and there were TV stations, local TV stations popping out every now and then. And suddenly what was a remote area became a complete, how shall I put it? It was just full of interfering radio signals, and it was a nightmare. In fact, Swarup's team has done things like they would go around trying to detect radiation from all the TV antenna boosters. They would redesign a booster and exchange a good booster which did not radiate into the GMRT band for the old cheap boosters. They've had to battle with arcing from high tension wires. They've had to battle with telephone mobile towers. It's been an upward fight. People simply didn't understand the amount of effort and sensitivity of this telescope. And that's been one of the remarkable successes that nobody really talks about, this ability to convince people that there is this phenomenal instrument and that we need to do whatever it takes to make sure it works. I can tell you from a personal experience, I was one of the few radio astronomers who went and spent 3 years between 2003 and 2006 at Narayanganj, which is close to the telescope. There was a lot of unhappiness in the community because permission for mobile towers it was a protracted battle of whether or not permission to be given for mobile towers. And a lot of people were blaming, not without reason, that the GMRT was the reason why the Narayanganj community were not being allowed good mobile access. I remember once I had gone to have my hair cut. I was sitting on the barber's chair, and he found out that I was from GMRT. He was shaving my side locks. He had that sharp razor in his hand, that razor in his hand. And there was this dramatic moment when he sort of held up the razor and said, "So tell us, when are we going to get the mobile connection?" It's a tale which has been repeated many times in GMRT, that how Ramana panicked when he saw the blade and this question, because it was a very fraught question. It was a question which had a lot of emotions in it, because people felt that they were being asked to sacrifice many things for the sake of this instrument. And it is to the credit of the GMRT team that they slowly worked their way through this to figure out how you could have mobile towers and also have a telescope of this magnitude. When Swarup built this telescope, he didn't want it to be a Me Too telescope. He didn't want it to be just another telescope. He didn't even want it to be as good as some other telescope in the world. He would always tell us, when you have to aspire for something, you must aspire to make it the best in the world. And he did indeed. For the time when it was, for about 10 years, it was the most sensitive radio telescope in the world at low frequencies. And roughly half the usage of the telescope has come from foreign astronomers wanting to use this telescope because there was nothing else remotely as sensitive anywhere in the world. Telescope time is allocated on a competitive basis, like you have proposals for funding. Astronomers write proposals competing for telescope time. It is peer reviewed, and the community allocates time to its own people based on the peer review process. And about half the usage of GMRT has come from people abroad. So one of the things which, as I told you, was remarkable about Swarup was his ambition. It was the first time I came across somebody that old, in his 40s and 50s, who wasn't ashamed of expressing his ambition. It's not a common trait in India. He built the GMRT to detect what are called Zeldovich pancakes. It was very obvious. It was very obvious that the theoretical prediction was that there would be these massive clouds of hydrogen gas, primordial hydrogen gas, and the then theory of what was called the top-down model of cosmology predicted that this would be at the limit of detection, and the GMRT was built to detect that. And it was no secret that if indeed that detection happened, the astronomer who did find that would get the Nobel Prize. It was pretty clear to everybody in the community, and the GMRT was built to detect Zeldovich pancakes. And he wanted it to be the best in the world. I remember an occasion when Govind, I forget now, sometime in the mid 90s, he was elected a fellow of the Royal Society, and we were going to have a small celebration in the canteen, and we were all moving towards the canteen, and I saw Govind coming out of the canteen. He had to go somewhere for a minute and come back. I said, Govind, congratulations for the FRS. And it requires some chutzpah to tell, in public, it's okay. Keep your congratulations for a while yet. There is one more step to go. It was very obvious to me and to others around me what that other step he was looking out for. He was absolutely not inhibited about expressing what his ambitions were. And in my opinion, it's not a bad trait. On the contrary, it's a trait which a few more Indian scientists can learn to develop. Indeed, it was not just the boast of a man who did not understand himself. I was having dinner in 1998 or 1999. I was a postdoc in France, and I was having dinner with 3 or 4 people. One of them was Francois Boucher. Boucher was one of the principal investigators for the Planck mission. Planck is the most advanced satellite which went up and it's the current record holder for the most sensitive observations of cosmological parameters. So one of the people in the dining room was Francois Boucher. Another person was Alain Omo, and the third person was Alain Omo's what used to be called those days girlfriend. It's currently called a partner. And as I later realized, she was actually Umakant's postdoc supervisor. These were all very, very well-known people in the French community. And the talk came up about, during the dinner was being hosted because Swarup was visiting Paris. And so 5 of us were having dinner. And during the discussion, it came the question of world-beating events came up. And I must tell you that suddenly the 3 French people shifted their speech to French from English. They were talking English until then. And one of them looked across at Swarup and told in French to the other 2, well, we are looking at a man who might well get the Nobel Prize if the theory is correct and he detects them. So we're really talking about a man who understood how good he was and what it took to compete with the best in the world. And he would always say, it is okay to fail as long as you fail in with a spectacular ambition, because even if you fail, you leave behind a legacy which is remarkable. And in my opinion, the fact that the theory turned out to be wrong, that there were no Zeldovich pancakes to be detected, in my opinion, makes no difference about the greatness of what Swarup has done, because he built a telescope for us so that we wouldn't ever have to go begging for telescope time. We wouldn't be forced to collaborate with foreigners in order to be given some crumbs off the table. It was a big thing for him that people like us would have our own instrument to do world-class research. And this is something that I will always remember, that he taught us that ambition is a good thing. I remember once as usual, I used to work late at night, and as 12 o'clock at midnight, I was roaming the corridors. I was running some image processing on the computer. Suddenly I saw Govind charge into the corridor. I asked him what happened, because he looked very shaken, and he just waved me away and ran towards his office. I was very worried about why he was behaving in that manner. Half an hour later, he came out of his office. He was calmer, and asked him what happened. And he said that there was a report that 3 astronomers in the US had detected the Zeldovich pancakes. He was just completely shaken. But he was building the whole instrument to detect it, and to be scooped at that late stage would have been like completely heart-rending. But as it turned out, that particular report was a false news. They withdrew the paper a few years later, but it was, to me, it was a statement on, he was very clear of what he wanted to be, and he didn't care what anybody else thought about it. My actual work with Swarup, most of the time I was a PhD during this period, and my actual work with Swarup was happened after I joined NCRA as a faculty in 2003. One of the problems with the telescope, because of all these mobile transmission and TV stations and all the muck in the electromagnetic spectrum in the radio regime, was the telescope performance was a factor of 10 to 20 worse than its theoretically design limit. And one of the first tasks that I did was let me stop before that. So in 1997, after I finished my PhD, I started contributing a bit more towards the telescope. About 6 or 8 antennas had come up, and I was going there helping with observations in their debugging and so on. Around that time, Swarup retired. He turned 65. This would have been 1995. He had to retire, and it's an unfortunate fact of life that no matter how much of power you wield, once you retire, you're retired. And people were, well, actually very busy trying to build his telescope, and most people didn't have any time for him, right? He would go and spend days on end at the GMRT, but he realized that nobody had the time to meet him anymore now that he wasn't the director. To me, it's one of the most remarkable things, something that I have great respect for him for, that at the age of 65, remember, he had not done hardcore analysis for about 25 years. He had given that up because he was trying to make sure that people in his team could build a telescope. But at the age of 65, when computers had changed, had morphed beyond anything that he could have dreamt of since he had last used computers in the 70s or 80s, he started learning computers, and he started learning how to process images by himself. And he would make a pain of himself, I can tell you. Here we were trying hard to make sure that his telescope was working, and he was a menace in the corridors. Whenever he saw any one of us, he would pull out a notebook and you'd say, "Hey, Ramana, I need 5 minutes of your time." And he would come charging towards you. And you knew that if you stopped and met him, you lost 3 hours of your day, because he wanted tutorials. He wanted to learn how to analyze the data. He wanted to do everything because nobody else was helping him. For me, you're sort of conflicted deeply. You see that kind of commitment and that kind of enthusiasm at the age of 65, and you want to stop and help him. On the other hand, if you start giving him a tutorial on how to analyze data, you spend 3 hours of what you were 3 hours away from what you're supposed to do on the telescope. So I'm sorry to say that some of us, many of us, as soon as we saw Swarup, would sort of sneak into the nearest doorway to avoid him. Though, of course, we would always, given the respect with which we viewed him, we would always find time later on to go and help him with whatever he wanted. In fact, very often it was easier to go and help him just do what he wanted than to try and teach him. But he wasn't going to give up. If it took him effort to learn what had to be learned at the age of 65, he was willing to do it. For me, again, that's another remarkable lesson. He was not going to give up no matter what. If he had to learn something all over again, he was going to do it. One of the first works that I did after I joined back as faculty was to deal with this problem of corruption of data. It took me 4 years. It took me 4 years to publish just one paper, but actually showed some way of improving the telescope performance by a factor of 5 or 10. It's a huge change. That day when I gave a seminar in NCRA, as usual, seminars were supposed to be 45 minutes, but that day I talked for 3 hours and people sat there for 3 hours, and including Swarup. And the day afterwards, he cornered me in my office and he said, "I want to talk to you." And he led me through this whole process of all the ideas he has for making it even better. This was in 2008. 2008, he was 79 years. At 79 years, he was still trying hard to figure out why the telescope wasn't performing well as he had hoped. We all knew, of course, the problem was the environment around the telescope had changed a lot. And he was trying to figure out how to make it work better. He, unfortunately, 79, 80, he was clearly past the time when he could be useful in these matters. Nobody had the heart to tell him that. Swarup, of all the people in NCRA who had retired from NCRA, Swarup was the only one who was given an office. He could walk in and out anytime he wanted. And he was still trying hard to grab whatever project student he would get from whichever college that he could get and try and get them to do the things that he had some idea for. For me, it was both inspiring, and it was both inspiring and it was somewhat sad. The man didn't know when to give up, and the man didn't know how to give up, and he was nudging 80. Having said all that, I must also say at the end of the talk, I'm close to that, at the end of the talk, it wasn't easy working with Swarup. A man so driven, a man so ambitious. He fueled his dream for himself and for an entire community of radio astronomers with his boundless energy and boundless ambition. And a man as driven as that is never easy to work with. He did not ask anything. He didn't ask you to respect him. He didn't ask you to kowtow to him. He didn't ask you to bow to him. All he asked was, can you be useful to this vision that I have, that he had? And if you were good enough for that vision, if you could contribute, he gave you whatever you wanted. And it's an unfortunate fact of life that in a community like that, when people are building this phenomenal facility, it often happens that the people who are most skilled get dumped on a lot more. Whereas people who are less skilled, who are less interested in contributing to the common facility, tend to escape with whatever little they do. With the result that there used to be a lot of friction, and there would be a lot of people, very, very smart people who contributed a lot to this telescope, who felt that they didn't get their due because they spent all their time on the telescope, while others who didn't put as much time on the telescope published a lot of papers and got a lot more credit in the international community. But I think at some level, there are two things. One, with age, I realize perhaps there is no other way for building a facility this large. It's really, I think some of the people who have actually set up experimental labs understand the amount of effort it would take to build something of this size in India in the 1990s with almost no resources. Swarup did what he had to do. And as I said, a lot of people complained, a lot of people fought with him. But at some level, everybody, even those who fought with him, realized that he was providing the platform for an achievement which was bigger than all of us, and something that we could look back and say it was done. We could look back with great pride and said, boy, I enjoyed doing that. I was not in that position of having to work under him. I think it would have been terrible working with him in certain situations, because he would never let go. He would be constantly badgering you. He would be constantly encouraging you to get outside of your own skin and do something worth more than what you thought you were worth. It was a constant process for him, trying to squeeze every bit of your ability out of you. As I said, I saw him working from up close, but I never actually worked under him. So in that sense, I could actually enjoy the process of watching him the way he was, without bearing the burden of having to please him all the time. I'm not sure who selected this image for the poster, but for me, this is in some sense the way I remember Swarup. It's sort of so quintessential of Swarup. When I look at this picture, I see this quiet confidence, a man, an ambitious person who's very clear about what he's worth and where he's headed. And he's got that sly smile which says, you know what, I'm going to challenge you. And I'm going to see if you're worth what you think you are. And to his credit, he would always be hoping that you would measure up to be even more than what he had challenged you. And that was the constant feedback we got from him, that you cannot afford to be a mediocrity. You have to aspire to something greater than yourself. This is a picture that was printed for a conference for 90th year, the one on the left, 90th year of Govind Swarup. There was a meeting at GMRT at NCRA, the meter wavelength sky. And here are the 5 facets of Swarup. Swarup as an old man, Swarup here, Swarup as young man on this side, and the telescope in the middle. For me, the 2 pictures I'll keep with me all the time about him are these 2 that I've shown on the right side. The first I've already talked about. And the second is a man, a leader, a director. I can tell you what he's doing there. He's either badgering you about some work that you should have done that you haven't done, and he's very upset with you. Or he's trying to encourage you to say, look, you're much better than what you've done. You're much better than what you think you are. I think you should be more ambitious than what you are. And I want you to deliver much more than what you've delivered. Both of them were a burden as well as an enormously enabling attitude. And I want to end this by saying, it's been a real privilege to have worked with him and to have got this opportunity to talk about one who is the most inspirational scientist that I have ever come across in India. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful talk. I'm sure all of us were left with a sense of fascination and pride by learning about Professor Swarup, life and work, and how he was truly a legend. Now we are at the end of this event. We would like to thank our faculty coordinator, IISER Pune Physics Chair, Professor Tarun Sauradeep, whose constant support and encouragement made this event possible. We would also like to thank Professor Vijay Agarwala and Professor Sunita Vardarajan from IISER Pune Physics Department for helping us immensely with the logistics and publicity of the talk. Finally, we are grateful to the audience for participating in today's talk and making it a successful event. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Also, for those who couldn't attend the talk today, we will be uploading it on our YouTube channel. Again, thank you all for joining us today. We bid you goodbye and good evening.